In this next section, I'm going to discuss the science and theory of dynamometer training. If you truly understand what you're doing from a mechanical, neurological, and biological standpoint with the intervention or the test on these machines, you can take that knowledge and apply it to any application on the machine and then match that to your patient. Now, at the end of the course, we're actually going to go over some specific injury protocols for the machine. But as with any program, you have to know what's going on with your patient's phase of rehab and their deficits in order to prescribe the best interventions. Now, when I was a student and then working under John Hashimoto, he would always tell me that you can train anybody to push the buttons and switches on the machine or follow along with the protocol. The key is understanding why the protocol is in place. What's the purpose behind each intervention, and why are we waiting until certain points in the rehab to start different interventions? It's the reason behind using the dynamometer training and combining the art with the science. Well, that's where we need to operate as rehab specialists. One example that I like to use is the difference between being a cook and a chef. The cook will simply follow a recipe from a cookbook, whereas the chef creates that culinary experience. A chef needs to be able to adjust and change how they approach the same dish for different people with different palates. And the same holds true for us with our patients, and that we have to be able to adjust our approach and our interventions because no two injuries or patients are the exact same. So once you understand these concepts that I'll discuss next, you'll be able to use the dynamometer to assess and treat your patients with a level of skill beyond somebody simply following a protocol. Now, another thing I want to talk about before we get into the science and theory is that what we're doing with the machine is only part of the patient's plan of care or daily visit. So when I tell other therapists that I use isokinetics, they seem to think that this is all I do. But what they don't get is that I'm still doing all the other interventions that they are. So here's a sample pie chart of how you can break down generally a patient's 1 hour visit. So you can see that I'm spending about 15 to 20 minutes of the session on the machine, and the rest of the time we're doing all of our other interventions for the patient. So even though in this course, we're just talking about isolating weak links and treating and testing one joint or one muscle group, keep in mind that we're still doing all of our manual therapy. We're still performing closed kinetic multiplanar exercise for the lower limb. We're still performing scapular exercise for the upper body. We're still training the core for functional stability and movement, and we're still doing balanced proprioception. We're still doing all of the other interventions that we have to do for our patients' specific deficits, impairments, and dysfunction. This is a great slide that describes and demonstrates not only what we're trying to accomplish with the dynamometer, but also globally with our rehab. And that is, we're trying to restore our patients back to a normal or optimal state of health. For the dynamometer, we're focusing in on the muscles and tendons. And the key is to identify and address the weak links. Another great quote that I've heard is that you cannot have functional movement with a dysfunctional segment. If you've taken any functional movement courses, then you've heard of the concept of regional interdependence. If one body segment is stiff when it should be mobile, or if it's meant to be a stabilizer and it has excessive movement, then the adjacent body segments are going to have to adjust and compensate in order to accomplish a movement task. And the same holds true with our course. But if we're not able to assess our patients and find those weak links or isolated deficits, or if we're unable to train them specifically, then how are we going to successfully train them in those functional movement or strength patterns? Here's a slide that you're going to see throughout the course, and it highlights the basic roadmap of the course, but also a generic plan of care. For each major phase of the rehab, there's an application that can be used with the machine for your patient to address those weak links and get them on to the next phase and back to function. So as we go through this course, I want you to think about some of your patients that you're either currently treating or that you've treated in the past and how they could have benefited from the applications on the machine. In our discussion into the science and theory of isokinetic training, these are the 5 major concepts: the mode of contraction, the mode of exercise, the speed of contraction, muscle strengthening, and neurologic adaptation. The first concept is the mode of contraction. Our muscles are only able to contract in 3 ways. In isometric contraction, there's no movement of the muscle or the joint angle. For a concentric contraction, the muscle contracts in the same direction as the change in the joint angle and the muscle shortens. In contrast, in eccentric contractions, the muscle contraction occurs in the opposite direction as the change in the joint angle and the muscle elongates. Why is this such an important concept? It's because we have to recognize that when an injury occurs, what is the mechanism of the injury? And more importantly, what is the mode of contraction that the injury occurred in? If you think about the examples that I have listed below, you'll find that with all of them, these injuries occur in the eccentric mode of contraction. In the picture on the right, the inversion ankle sprain that you see is an example of an eccentric failure of the fibularis muscles to control the ankle. So this is telling us already that by putting a focus on testing and training in the eccentric mode is going to be very important. Let's put together a chart where we compare the modes of contraction to something that we all know well, a car. For the isometric mode, in the body, it serves as a stabilizer of the joint or the body segment. It can protect the joint against excessive motion, or it creates rigidity of the joint, allowing for adjacent joints or segments to generate movement or force. In the example of a car, it acts as the suspension. Concentric contractions act as an accelerator in the body. It's what we use to raise our arm up to hang up a shirt or stand up from a chair. We can also use it in athletics to accelerate a ball or overcome gravity and jump up in the air. In the example of a car, it's the motor. We all want a strong, powerful motor. Now, traditionally in isokinetics, all exercise and testing is done in the concentric mode of contraction, getting that motor to become stronger and faster. For the eccentric mode, in our bodies, it serves as a decelerator. We use it to lower ourselves down the stairs or into a chair. We use it to catch ourselves from falling when we catch our toe on the carpet. Athletically, it slows our arm down after we release the ball, or it allows us to change directions when sprinting. In the car, it's the brakes. We generally do a good job of focusing on the eccentric mode during our close kinetic exercise. But traditionally, when it comes to isokinetic strength training, it gets completely ignored as the concentric mode is used for reciprocal muscle actions. Now, at least the therapists who do this recognize the weak links in the chain, but when this happens, the patient's motor gets stronger and faster, but we're not matching that same volume of training on the eccentric mode. And a strong motor without adequate brakes leads to problems for our patients. Functionally, we use isometric contractions for joint stability. In rehab, we use it for early muscle contraction to help reduce atrophy and improve neuromuscular firing. Because there's no movement occurring, there's little stress on the joint, ligaments, and minimal stress to the muscle and tendon. When we exercise at a certain angle, there's an exercise carryover that occurs up to 10 degrees on either side of that angle. So if you're performing isometric exercise at 50 degrees of knee flexion, then the carryover will occur from 40 to 60 degrees. And we're going to take advantage of that when we discuss multi-angle isometrics later in the course. On the concentric side, this is used for acceleration activities, such as throwing a ball, or for overcoming gravity, as with jumping. There is movement occurring here as the myosin and actin ratchet together toward the center and the muscle shortens as it generates force. Eccentric contractions are primarily responsible for deceleration or for absorbing force, just like when you land from a jump. Here, the myosin and actin are still trying to ratchet toward their center, but because the external load is greater than the force created by the muscle, it elongates. Aside from the active components creating force, the passive structures in the system also contribute to force, and this includes the titin filaments within the sarcomere as well as the tendon. So this will allow some increased force production to occur simply from a mechanical aspect. Also, there's a different viscoelastic response from the muscle and tendon to loading. Now, there's also some very important differences between concentric and eccentric beyond the direction that the muscle is moving. First and most important is the difference in neurologic activity. Because the muscle and tendon are being stretched under load, the Golgi tendon organ and the muscle spindles are going to be excited. Just like with reflex testing, there's going to be a big neural contribution. So with this, you can get 2 to 3 times less EMG activity of the muscle during eccentric contraction compared to concentric when the load is matched. That basically means an improved neurologic efficiency. Also, we're going to stimulate our fast twitch muscle fibers at lighter loads. So when our patients are not able to exercise under heavy conditions due to injury or surgery, we can still engage those strength fibers early in the rehab process by focusing on eccentric loads. We're also going to have a superior enhancement in the power and plyometric effect by focusing on eccentrics, as that's what activates the stretch shortening cycle. Apart from the neurologic side, the muscle requires 70 to 75% less oxygen utilization for eccentric versus concentric when matched for load. Again, it's more efficient. All of these effects will result in about 30% greater force-producing capacity of the system eccentrically. The one downside to eccentric focus training is the amount of delayed onset muscle soreness that occurs. So during our other rehab exercises, including closed kinetic chain, we wouldn't have our patients focus only on the concentric contraction. So why are we doing this with our isokinetic machines? Again, the traditional isokinetic training has one muscle perform the concentric, and then its antagonist performs another concentric, bringing it back to the start position. So the eccentric mode is never used. In this course, you're going to learn how you can put the eccentric focus into your isokinetic training and testing. Now let's go back to the discussion on the mode of contraction during the mechanism of injury and combine it with the neurologic side. At the top of this slide, we have a stick figure doing a sprint, and we're going to focus on the leg with that thicker line. In this study, the authors looked at the EMG activity of different muscle groups during the sprint with each muscle in a different row. The portion that I circled is when the runner is decelerating the tibia to prepare for initial contact, and that's the dotted line going down. You can see that the glutes fire eccentrically first as they start decelerating the femur, and then the hamstring and adductors start firing eccentrically as they're slowing down the tibia as it nears full knee extension. This is where most hamstring injuries actually occur. Now, the hamstring stays active through stance phase as it helps extend the hip and propel the body forward concentrically. You can also see that the quadriceps kicks in highest just before initial contact to absorb knee flexion eccentrically. Here's a classic study by Job et al., and it's a great example for the shoulder. The phases of pitching are shown at the top of the slide with the EMG activity of each muscle across the bottom, and it's listed by phase of pitch. You can see that the maximum muscle EMG occurs at the follow-through phase when the shoulder is decelerating the arm after releasing the ball. This is where most of your rotator cuff strains are going to occur. The second concept for this portion of the course is the mode of exercise. The four modes of exercise are passive, isometric, isokinetic, and isotonic. Passive exercise is used right after surgery or injury for regaining range of motion, reducing pain and swelling. There's no patient input required as they completely relax and let something perform the motion for them. Now, we're also going to take advantage of passive exercise during our isokinetic training to focus on eccentric contractions, but more on that later. For isometric exercise, as we've already discussed, it's going to be used for early muscle activity to reduce atrophy, get neurologic activity to the muscle, as well as provide early controlled stress and strain to the system. There's the 10-degree carryover from the angle, and the patient only has to control the amount of force output. With isokinetic exercise, there is movement occurring. The speed will be constant, but the resistance will accommodate to the patient's level of effort. The patient has to control the level of force as well as the direction of contraction. In rehab, we use this for early neuromuscular control, beginning eccentric loading, strength training, and deceleration training. Now, you can still perform the traditional isokinetic training, but hopefully after this course you can see its shortcomings. When we're talking about the mode of exercise, isokinetic is the best mode for strength training. At the extreme ends of the range of motion, the muscle is at a mechanical disadvantage due to the changes of lever arm as well as a reduced amount of cross-bridge formation in the sarcomere. But because the machine will accommodate the resistance to match the patient's level of effort, the muscle can be exercised at a maximum demand throughout the range of motion, so it eliminates any sticking points that can occur with traditional isotonic training. This is a slide that John created early in his career that demonstrates the point. The graph on the left has force on the y-axis against the range of motion going across the x-axis. Now, this is the typical torque curve for the quadriceps, with full extension on the left and full flexion on the right. You can see that as the knee starts in extension, the amount of torque the quad is able to produce is minimal, but as it nears mid-range, the force output increases until it peaks around 70 degrees before reducing as the knee moves toward full flexion. The graph on the right plots the percentage of muscle capacity on the y-axis with the same range of motion on the x-axis. You can see that because the resistance changes, the muscle gets exercised at the same level of intensity throughout the range of motion. This is going to contrast with what's coming up next with isotonic resistance. In isotonic exercise, the resistance is constant with the variable speed throughout the range of motion. The patient now has to control the torque or force output, the velocity, and direction. In rehab, this is used for strength training sub-maximally in the early phases and then maximally in the later phases. It's also used for endurance training, as you can lower the resistance and increase the repetitions. On the machine, we're going to show you how you can use the software to do both of these, but also in a way that significantly enhances neuromuscular control and proprioception. I'm also going to show you how you can use the machine for power training and rate of force production in the later phases of rehab. So with isotonic mode, the resistance is constant, but I put that in quotes because from the muscle's perspective, it's not. I told you earlier that the muscle has a mechanical disadvantage at end ranges, but it's strongest in the middle range. So when the resistance is held constant, the muscle has to work harder at certain points than others. So what happens is that in order for the patient to complete the full range of motion, the load has to be low enough for the weakest points to overcome it. If not, then you get sticking points and they have to compensate or cheat to get through the range. This slide shows the same graphs we saw with isokinetic, except for now they represent isotonic exercise. The graph on the left plots force along the y-axis with range of motion along the x-axis. Because the resistance is constant, the line is straight. The graph on the right plots percentage of muscle capacity along the y-axis and range of motion along the x-axis. At the beginning and end of the range of motion, where we're weakest, the muscles have to work harder to overcome the resistance, so the line is higher. But in the middle, where we're stronger, the muscles don't have to work very hard, so the percentage of muscle capacity is lower. So with traditional isotonic exercise, we're robbing our muscles of their ability to strengthen throughout the entire range of motion, as the stimulus for hypertrophy is not being met except for at end ranges. One more thing about isotonic versus isokinetic. This slide shows an ankle inversion isokinetic strength test. Now we're going to go over how to read and interpret these later in the course, but for now I just want to use it as an example of muscle capacity. If we look at the graph on the left, these show the eccentric strength curve. Now I put a line along the neutral ankle position for reference. The right ankle is in blue and the left is in red, so clearly the injured ankle is the right side, but that's not important for now. The curve to the left of the neutral line is eversion and the curve to the right is inversion. So you should notice that the everter muscle torque curve is much higher with the ankle in the inverted position when it's lengthened, and the line is much lower with it in the everted or shortened position. In fact, it's about twice as strong for this test. But let's think about how we traditionally isolate everters in rehab. Here I am with an elastic resistance on my left ankle working my everters. In the picture on the left, my ankle is inverted, but the band resistance is minimal. So if we flash back to the graph, you can see that's where my muscle is actually its strongest. In the picture on the right, I've now everted my ankle, pulling the band into maximal resistance for the range. But in this position, the everters are at their weakest point. And since we want our patients working the entire range of motion, we set the elastic resistance to match that weakest point. So bands are inexpensive, but they can't maximally strengthen the ankle muscles to the highest capacity like an accommodating resistance isokinetic exercise can. Moving on to our next concept. Concept 3 is the speed of contraction. If we look at this figure known as the force velocity curve, it gives us a lot of insight into how to manipulate the speeds of contraction to progress our patients and maximize our interventions. In the graph, the y-axis going up represents force output capability, so the higher up you go, the more force is being produced. The x-axis is velocity, with the middle vertical line being zero or no motion, and velocity increasing as you go out both directions, left and right. The left side of the zero line is an eccentric contraction where the muscle is lengthening, and the right side of the line is a concentric contraction with the muscle shortening. The point where the torque line meets the vertical y-axis represents an isometric contraction, as there's no movement occurring at that point. Now, the way this torque curve came to be is that if you take a patient and you test their muscle at both slower and faster concentric and eccentric contractions, as well as an isometric contraction, and you plot the maximum torque achieved on this graph, you get this line. So let's start with the contraction and speed with the lowest ability to produce torque. As it turns out, a faster concentric contraction produces the least amount of torque. The main reason for this is that you're using much of your strength just catching up to the speed of the dynamometer, and then what's left over gets pushed into the adapter arm and recorded as strength. As you move to a slower concentric speed, the muscle's ability to produce torque increases. It increases even further when you move to an isometric contraction. If you want to further increase the muscle's ability to produce torque, you have to then move to an eccentric contraction at lower speeds. And then as you go faster and faster in the eccentric mode, the more torque the muscle can produce. Now let's go back to traditional isokinetic training, which trains only the concentric mode. Many therapists will increase the speeds concentrically as their patient progresses, and they're doing it because they think they're working towards functional speeds. But as you can see with the graph, they're actually getting less muscle output as they do that. Now you're going to see that in this course, we're going to encourage you to utilize isometric and then eccentric contractions with increasing speeds as your patient progresses. Now, one thing to keep in mind, this force velocity curve is specific to isokinetic exercise, where the velocity is fixed and the resistance accommodates. Next, let's move on to the isotonic force velocity curve, because it's different. So here we see the isotonic force velocity curve. If you first focus in on the graph itself, it's basically just the inverse of what you saw with the isokinetic graph with the eccentric and concentric sides flipped. So to explain this, let's start on the isometric point on the graph. In the description, it's right in the middle of the slide. The example I want to use for this is the squat. So if I'm standing with the bar across my back just before I begin my squat, that's an isometric hold. If my bar weighs 225 pounds, then it's pushing down on me with 225 pounds, and I'm matching that amount and putting 225 pounds of force up into the bar. If we move to the right of the isometric point on the graph, that's slow eccentric lowering. So now say I'm only putting 210 pounds of force into the bar. So it's going to slowly overcome me and lower me to the floor. But let's say we go even further to the right of the graph, and now I'm lowering faster, and say I'm only giving 100 pounds of force into the bar. So you see, the less force I produce eccentrically, the faster I'll go. Now let's jump back to the isometric point. I'm now at the bottom of my squat, and I'm holding the bar, and I'm matching it at that 225 pounds. But if I want to raise myself back up, I have to push at least the weight of the bar's worth of force, and then some. So let's say I give it 230 pounds of force. So now I'm going to raise up concentrically but slowly. On the graph, that's moving just to the left of that isometric point. But if I want to accelerate it up faster, I have to give more force. If I give enough force to overcome both the weight of the bar and my body weight, then I'll jump. So this is just a long-winded description of the difference between isokinetic and isotonic speed selection. And the only reason I did this is just to illustrate the counterpoint about using faster isokinetic speeds concentrically to try to mimic functional exercise speeds and explosiveness. But when we go into how we can use isotonic exercise on the machine later in the course, we're going to use this principle to discuss and demonstrate rate of force production and power training on the dynamometer in the later phases of rehab. Back to our third concept of speed. As our patient progresses in their rehab, what are some of the ways that we typically progress them? Well, the first answer most people will give is, say, increase the weight or mass. Now, that's not a bad answer for sure, but let's think about other ways to progress them. Again, I'm going to use the squat as an example. So we will typically start them off in a reduced range of motion, such as a mini squat or a wall squat, or maybe even unweight them a little bit on a leg press, a total gym, or a shuttle. And as they progress, we get them off the machines and into full body weight, and then we start increasing the depth of the squat. Other things we can do once they're in a full squat depth is to manipulate the speed by either slowing down or speeding up both contraction modes. We can also put them on unstable surfaces. Maybe we'll have them go to a unilateral stance for a single leg squat, which is dynamically increasing the mass. Now, once I actually start adding mass, I'll have them hold light dumbbells in each hand, and once the weight gets a bit heavier, then I'll have them go to a goblet squat, and that'll bring in the core and the upper body. And once they have that down, then I like to have them hold the dumbbell unilaterally and really challenge them dynamically. And yes, I also start loading up the resistance once they get into the later phases of rehab. So this is the functional isotonic side of the equation. But what about on the isokinetic machines? How should we progress our patients on those, because we don't have all those options available on the machines? Well, if we think about what changes during functional activity and the reason behind doing some of our functional exercise progressions, we can see the why and the how and have it translate over to isokinetics. So during activity, the mass of the body and the ball doesn't change, but what does change is the acceleration or deceleration of the body or the ball. So that's what we're going to focus on with our dynamometer. If force is equal to mass times acceleration or deceleration for eccentric actions, so we can increase the force by manipulating the speeds. If we go back to the isokinetic force velocity curve, you'll remember that the faster we go eccentrically, the more force the patient will be able to produce. So we can start our patients off isometrically at the beginning and then start with slow eccentric loading, working the speeds faster as they progress. Now with isokinetics, another unique way we can progress the patient is by having them increase the percentage of effort they give. Since the machine accommodates, they can start off with minimal force production, say 25% effort. And as they progress, we can then increase to 50% effort, and then 75 or 75+% effort as the weeks pass. So we have a lot of different options available to us on isokinetic machines that you don't with the functional isotonic exercise. How can we standardize our speeds, and how can we define them? What makes a speed slow, moderate, or fast? Well, what we like to do is relate everything to the range of motion in which the exercise is occurring. For example, if we use knee flexion extension to exercise the quad, and we're exercising the patient from 10 degrees of extension to 90 degrees of flexion, that gives us a total range of motion of 80 degrees. Now, later we'll discuss why we limit the range of motion of knee extension to 10 degrees and not 0, but for right now, we're just going to talk about the speed. So if we define our slow speeds as half or less of the total range of motion, so in this example of 80 degrees of motion, a slow speed would be 40 degrees per second or slower. A moderate speed is half the range of motion up to 2 times the range of motion. Our example here is from 40 degrees per second to 160 degrees per second. A fast speed is defined as 2 times the range of motion or faster. So here we're talking about 160 degrees per second or faster. Well, why does this matter? Well, when you have a joint with a big range of motion like the knee compared to a small joint with a smaller range of motion, such as ankle inversion and eversion, and you're only exercising them from 10 degrees of eversion to 30 degrees of inversion, well, that's only a total of 40 degrees, and it's half of what we're talking about with the knee. And when you have a smaller total range of motion, the speeds feel faster because the machine will change directions quickly once it gets to the end of the motion. So the actual speeds used will differ based on the joint when we talk about starting in slow and progressing to moderate or fast speeds. Our fourth concept for this portion of the lecture is muscle strengthening. Now, this is really where we put most of our efforts in as a rehab specialist. If there weren't any strength deficits or imbalances that led to the injury, or strength loss and atrophy after the injury, there really wouldn't be much need for us. We just let the tissue healing occur and the patient would go right back to activity safely, but that's not the case. When dealing with muscle strengthening, there are only a few concepts to focus on. If you can get these down, The rest of it is all in exercise selection and programming based on these principles. First is the SAID principle. That is, specific adaptations to impose demands. Basically, that means that you have to analyze the functional demands that the patient is going to encounter and match your program to meet or exceed those demands. Now, in the initial phases, we're trying to minimize tissue stress, allow tissue healing to occur, reduce atrophy, and promote neuromuscular learning. So those demands are a lot different than the endpoint. So the SAID principle changes as your patient's phases change. Now, when we move on to the next concept of neural adaptation, think back to the SAID principle, because if neuromuscular changes are your goal, you have to design your interventions around that goal. The next principle we're going to discuss is the overload principle, in which you have to manipulate the variables in order to overload the tissue and get it to respond and strengthen. As a student, John Hisimoto would always tell me to think of exercise as medicine, in which we're introducing an intervention to elicit a biological and mechanical change to the body. And we have to dose our interventions appropriately, just like we would with medicine. Too little and we don't get the change, but too much and we overdose them and we get adverse reactions. Now, we've already talked about ways to progress patients in general, but within any given exercise, we have to manipulate the resistance or the patient effort, if we're talking isokinetics, the number of repetitions, the rate of loading or speeds of exercise, as well as the exercise duration or time under tension. When discussing muscle strengthening, we have to talk about the difference between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. Type 1 are smaller, with less fibers per motor unit and a slower contraction speed. They produce less force, but they're also resistant to fatigue. We typically recruit these first when exercising or performing tasks, and it's our primary fiber for sustained or endurance activity. Type 2, on the other hand, are larger, have more fibers per motor unit, and have a faster contraction speed. They produce more force, but they fatigue easily. And we only use these fibers when the load of the exercise or task is heavier than what the type 1 fibers can handle, so they're recruited last as the difficulty increases. Now, typically, they're also used for brief or intense activity, but here's the thing. We need to get to our type 2 fibers in order to increase strength. But if our patients have injuries or they can't exercise with heavy resistance, then how are we going to get to those fibers and get strengthening to increase? And you'll see we have a few ways to get these fibers going at lighter loads earlier in the rehab. Now that brings me to the final concept I'll cover in this section, and that's neurologic adaptation. When it comes to rehab, even for pure musculoskeletal injuries, the neurologic aspect of strengthening is a major focus of our rehab and one of the ways we'll be using the machine for. Now, I just discussed the difference between type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers, and I mentioned that we only engage our type 2 strength fibers at higher force requirements. We only get to these fibers as the resistance increases, but there are a few ways to activate them earlier on. The first is during eccentric contraction. During eccentrics, there's a preferential recruitment of type 2 fibers over type 1. The other way we kick in our type 2 fibers at low resistance levels is with blood flow restriction training. At the end of the course, I'll talk about blood flow training and how you can combine it with the dynamometer. When we get neurologic adaptation from strength training, it occurs through two main mechanisms, spatial and temporal summation. Spatial summation is where there's an increase in the number of motor units that fire when you perform a task or exercise. Once this adaptation occurs, for the same exercise load, you get more motor units firing, so the number of muscle fibers involved will also be increased. The second mechanism, temporal summation, is when the frequency of firing to those motor units is increased. So when both occur, there's now more total units firing, and they're firing faster, leading to increased strength. This takes place in the first 6 to 8 weeks of training. And let's tie this back to our last concept of muscle strengthening in the SAID principle. I can train a certain way for 6 to 8 weeks and get neurologic adaptation to that specific training type. But if I then switch the stimulus in training type, then we get the neurologic system. It's going to make more adaptations to that new type of training. Like I said earlier, The eccentric mode of contraction has a different neurologic mechanism in place, and the eccentric mode is responsible for the stretch shortening cycle or plyometric effect, which is paramount for returning to athletic activity. So if a person doesn't train with the focus in the eccentric mode, they won't have made those adaptations by the time they reach their plyometric and agility portions of their training. In fact, the muscles will actually shut down neurologically when they're stressed to plyometric activity if they've not been trained for it. So this will lead them to make movement compensations, which can cause them to lose performance in their sport or re-injure themselves. So let's take the example of the quadriceps after ACL reconstruction. The muscle that atrophies away is the quadriceps, and it's going to be responsible for controlling sagittal plane knee flexion. If we can isolate that weak link in the eccentric mode and get those neurologic adaptations to occur before we get them into their dynamic sports activity, then they're not going to be making those movement compensations that can be harmful, and their transition to later phase rehab will be much smoother. If we take the example of the rotator cuff with our throwing athletes, since the external rotator decelerates the arm eccentrically after throwing, we can improve their success of getting into their throwing programs and returning to sports by addressing the eccentric mode for those external rotators well before they get back into throwing. Here's an older study by Kim and Kramer in which they looked at using visual feedback during isokinetic quadriceps testing. Half of the 40 healthy subjects, both male and female, were provided with visual feedback, and they had higher torque production in both concentric and eccentric contractions compared to the subjects without visual feedback. The authors also discussed how the eccentric contractions were more responsive to visual feedback, and they relate this back to the mechanisms such as preferential recruitment of type 2 muscle fibers, the muscle spindle stimulation, and the cross-bridging kinetics during eccentric contractions. This is a study that was performed out of Japan in 2018, in which they took 12 young, physically active, yet untrained males. They trained the quadriceps muscles twice a week for 10 weeks on an isokinetic machine, with one leg performing only eccentric contraction and the other leg performing only concentric contractions. The eccentric leg was done first for up to 6 sets of 10 reps, and then the concentric leg performed enough reps in each set to match the total amount of work in the first leg. They measured them with MRI for changes in cross-sectional area as well as EMG testing. They also tracked the exercise over the 10 weeks for changes in peak torques, work, and fatigue. They found that training in the eccentric mode of contraction on an isokinetic machine resulted in greater increases in strength, neural adaptation, and hypertrophic changes compared to concentric-only training when matched for total work. So again, make sure to focus on eccentric loading with your isokinetic exercises. Now, once these adaptations occur and that neurologic system is running at full steam, then you get into the muscle hypertrophy phase of strengthening, and this typically occurs after 6 to 8 weeks of training. Now that we've went through the science behind isokinetics, let's get into how you actually go about using it with your patients. And this is a great chart that shows the continuum of care with isokinetics, going all the way from range of motion through passive CPM, all the way through strength and control training with isokinetic and isotonics. And first, we're going to start with simple range of motion training with passive motion. In this first position, we're looking at passive motion for the knee in the prone position. And this is great for any hamstring strains or anybody that needs CPM in the prone position to help out with that terminal knee extension, similar to a prone hang. Now, the way that CPM works is if you're looking at a joint, and if a joint is swollen, as that knee or the shoulder or the ankle, as it moves back and forth through the open and closed back positions, that's going to create a pressure gradient inside that joint, and it increases and decreases with the motion. So when you do that, that creates a pumping mechanism that's going to pump out any extra swelling or blood that's inside that joint. Next, you can see us working CPM for the knee and sitting, very similar to what we saw in the prone position. Now, all your other tissues are going to be moved back and forth. So they're going to be stretched, shortened, elongated, and shortened. And that's going to cause it's going to reduce any scar tissue formation that's going to occur inside the muscles, the tendons, the ligaments, the retinaculum, and it frees everything up. Another thing that CPM does is it stimulates the mechanoreceptors of the joint and the tendon and the muscle, which is going to reduce and inhibit the nociception and make your pain less. And anybody who hasn't seen this gentleman before, that's John Hisimoto. He was my mentor all through my athletic training career and physical therapy career. All right, next we have an ankle CPM for dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. This is fantastic for anybody who's had an ankle sprain. This is also a great position for post-op Achilles tendon repairs. Because we have the knee in a flex position, as that ankle goes back and forth, even if you go to the neutral position, it's not going to put a lot of tension through that Achilles tendon. Now you can also do CPM for the dorsiflexors, plantar flexors with the knee extended, but we don't want to do that initially after a Achilles tendon repair. Next, our patient is going to be working CPM for ankle inversion and eversion. Another great, fantastic initial treatment on the machine after an ankle sprain. In this position, we're looking at hip internal and external rotation. This is really good, mostly for some of your older patients who have hip osteoarthritis. But if you have anybody who's recovering from a labrum repair, this is really good to use initially, so long as you stay within the range of motion restrictions. This next position is shoulder flexion and extension in the supine position. Now you can also work this in prone. You can do it in sitting as well. It's a great early technique for an injured shoulder or after a shoulder surgery to mobilize them. The advantage you get using the machine is that you can set the range of motion to a very precise angle to where it does not go beyond that motion. You can also set the speeds. You can set stretches, pauses. You can increase the range as you go. You can decrease the range as you go, all with clicking the mouse. It's very simple. It's very comfortable for the patient. It frees you up as a therapist. So now instead of me mobilizing his shoulder for the next 10 minutes and not being able to go anywhere else or work with any other patients, that frees me up as a clinician to go take care of other tasks. This is CPM for the shoulder, ERIR. Another really good way to increase motion, reduce pain, reduce any apprehension that the patient might have to the machine, reduces muscle spasm and muscle tone. It's a great intervention. And here you can see one of our college pitchers from a few years ago. We had to mobilize his elbow after Tommy John surgery. And this is a great way to do it. Really helps get that extension back quickly and reduces that swelling inside the joint. Now that your patient has good range of motion, their swelling and pain are down, we can start working on stabilizing. And in the machine, we use the isometric mode. And what this does for us is it allows a controlled early contraction and neuromuscular reeducation of the muscles. Now I'm only going to show you a few positions in this video, but any position that you saw in the range of motion, you can do it as well. Right now I'm doing an isometric hamstring contraction. I'm holding for 5 seconds, then I get a 10-second rest, and then it changes position. And typically we go every 10 to 20 degrees of the range of motion. Now in this video, it's only doing 1 contraction in each position, then moving, but typically we do 3 to 5 contractions before it moves, but that makes for a pretty boring video. You can also see on the video that there's a feedback that's given. The harder I pull into that hamstring pad, the higher up my torque bar goes. But there's other ways that we can look at this with the biofeedback that really help with the neuromuscular adaptations. I can put a target on the screen that the patient has to stay within that precise target. Think about early on after an ACL surgery or after a rotator cuff surgery. We're not wanting them to push hard. We're talking 5 to 10 foot-pounds of torque. Very light, but we're just wanting to make those muscles start to wake up and fire under safe, controlled positions. In this video, you can see Chris. He's one of our athletic trainers. He's doing multiple angles for shoulder external rotators. So now your patient's progressing, they're doing well, they're able to do light contractions, they're feeling better. Now we can start working on strength and control. And we're going to do this first with isokinetic, and then we'll go into isotonic after that. Now the first type that we're going to perform is a pure isokinetic eccentric unloading. And in this, the machine is going to lift the limb up for the concentric mode, and then the patient has to unload the weight of the limb in the eccentric mode. So we're going to zoom in a moment. So she's resting on the pad, and it's going to lift her tibia up. When she gets to the top, she's going to contract her quad, and she's going to lower down the weight of her own leg. Now, she's not pushing into the pad. She's not producing external force or torque or load. She's just controlling the weight of her own limb down. And we're starting out very slow, 5 degrees per second. Now, in these next few videos that you're going to see, we're going to move through the speed progressions. So this is 5 degrees per second. He's going to push up into the pad on the way down. And we're only working eccentrics. If you go back to earlier when we talked all about eccentric loading and the purposes of it, that's why we're only doing eccentrics early on. And each of these clips you're seeing is just 1 repetition from an entire set. To save time, I'm just showing you 1 set because I want to show you how the speeds progress as they get faster. And this next one is going to be 25 degrees per second and then 30 degrees per second. And we will advance them 5 degrees per second per week when it comes to ACLs in the knee. They'll do about 3 sets of 10, and we'll do that for a few rounds. Now we're getting to some faster speeds. This guy's going 60 degrees per second on this one, and then 80 degrees per second now, and then his next speed will be 100 degrees per second. So we're getting into what we call deceleration training as it gets faster and faster. You should see that each one is increasing in speed. Finally, you have Bradley. I have him set, I think, at 150 degrees per second here. As this is when we're getting into high speeds. Now, as they progress, you can even get into having them do both the concentric and the eccentric portions. Typically, when they get into those that deceleration training, we work the muscle both directions, concentric and eccentric. Now, another thing to keep in mind as you watch that video is we're only exercising 1 muscle group at a time. To keep the lecture short, I only showed you the knee. We could have went through any of those other positions that we saw earlier, but in each of those, they were only doing the quadriceps. Their hamstring was resting completely. Now, we would also exercise the hamstring in a completely different set, but what I showed you was quadricep only. Again, typical isokinetics, you push up with the quadricep, you pull back down with the hamstring, but that's not what we were having them do. We had them completely rest in the concentric portion, and then they did an eccentric quadriceps. So they were pushing up as the machine came down. So for the final video series, we're going to go into isotonics, And isotonics are really good for strengthening, but a big part of it is going to be neuromuscular control combined with the strength training. Now, the first thing I'm showing you in this video is using the machine truly as pure isotonics. I set it for 100 foot-pounds of torque, and I'm just pushing up and bringing it back down, just like you would on a normal knee extension machine. And that's not how we use the machine. I did it just to show you what it doesn't show you, because it doesn't give you any good feedback. This application is called pacing bar. And so you set your torque. You can set that for, say, 10 foot-pounds, 20 foot-pounds, 100 foot-pounds, whatever you set it to. But you can also set it to be different amounts of torque in both the concentric and the eccentric. So I can have it be heavier coming down eccentrically than I do going up. On this application, Bradley is controlling that blue line that goes across the screen. He has to pace himself or time his tempo to match that bar that goes up and down. And you can set this to be different speeds. It gives you a score, what percentage of time they're on target in concentric, what percentage of time they're on target in the eccentric. I have his just at 10 foot-pounds each direction. Usually when I do this, especially if it's later on, I like to make that eccentric load about 30% heavier. Now, when I first start doing any of these applications, I can actually set it to have no resistance at all. I can put 0 foot-pounds of torque. And if you look at my torque at the bottom of the screen where it says EXT and FLXS, that tells me the amount of torque that I have. And right now I have it set for 0 foot-pounds. So this is really good for neuromuscular control and proprioception shortly after injury or surgery. What I'm doing on this video, I'm just kind of going over the different aspects of the screen. So this is called roadway. The patient controls, again, they're just kicking up or pulling back down. And they have to control it and keep the little dot inside the purple lines or the roadway. And right there is where the patient's dot is. And you can set this roadway to be different shapes. It keeps track of the percentage of time that they're in the roadway. And you can set the difficulty to where if they're above 50% on target, that counts as a good rep. If they're below 50% of the target, that counts as a bad rep. Typically, I'll put this about, I like to get at least a B. So I'll set it to be an 80% on target. And you can see our patient here, she's working back and forth. Again, I don't have any resistance on it. I believe at this point she was about 8 weeks out of an ACL reconstruction. She was one of our local ballerina or ballet instructors in Tampa. Now, I believe on this next one, I purposely had her do a bad rep. So you can see what happens if she's outside of the roadway, the ball turns red, and she gets a bad rep. So if you look at the top left, you'll see she got a red dot for that one. Next, we're going to work on some pure proprioception and joint positioning. So in this, the patient controls the dot, and the computer puts a ring or a target on the screen. The patient's job is to get their dot into the target and hold it there, and it changes back and forth as they go. It keeps track of the amount of time that it takes for them to respond and get into the target, and then how long it took for them to actually hold steady in that position as well. This is really good early on to help reestablish neuromuscular education and proprioception, but you can also do this with resistance. Now, one thing you may have noticed in all these videos is that I have the tibial pad or the adapter pad higher up on the tibia in that mid shaft. That allows us to work the quadricep in an open chain without getting any anterior translation of the tibia and not putting any undue stress on the ACL. So that's a way that we can perform open chain exercise and resistance early in the rehab process without the dangers of risking a damage to that graft. This next one is called interactive path. And you can see Chris, he's going to do this with his shoulder. This is kind of like a maze. So he's going to control a dot, and the maze is going to go across the screen. And as it goes across, his job is to position his arm, or if it's his ankle or his knee, they position the joint to keep their dot right inside the maze. Now you can see on the torque at the bottom, I have it set to be 30% heavier in the eccentric mode. So it's 10 pounds when he's raising his arm up, but it's 13 pounds when he's coming down. Not only does that make it more challenging from a strength standpoint, that's going to give almost like a quick stretch reflex as he changes directions. It increases it. So it's really going to help to stimulate the neuromuscular adaptations that we're going to need for plyometric activity later on in the rehab. Not only is this a great way to work on strengthening, these programs or applications, they take 30 seconds to a minute. So it's really good for working on muscular endurance as well. And they're a lot of fun. So the patients really look forward to doing these at the end of their session. The next one is called Interactive Line, and it's very similar to what you saw with Interactive Path. Now you're going to have a series of lines that pass through the screen, and the patient's going to control 2 dots, and their job is to keep the line right in the middle of those 2 dots. Now I have Bradley on a pretty simple path here. It's very predictable. It just goes up and down in each rep. His range of motion is getting less. I have written some of these protocols that are much more complex and much more challenging for the patient, but this one's pretty simple here. So next, I'm going to show you a couple games, and the first one is Pong. In this, Bradley's going to control the paddle on the left by moving his knee through flexion and extension. The computer controls the paddle on the right. Bradley's job is to not let the ball get past his paddle. Each time he reflects it, I actually have it set to accelerate and get faster. If your patient's early in the process and you just want to work on positioning, proprioception, you can do this without any external load, or you can load this up as they get stronger. Because these typically tend to go on for 30 seconds, a minute on end, I usually don't set it to be extremely heavy. This is a great one to work on muscle endurance and not just pure strength. This next one's called Breakout. It's almost the same thing, except for now they're going to control a paddle across the bottom of the screen. Their job is to rebound the ball and break the bricks. Just like with Pong, it's really good for muscle endurance. Our patient here was dealing with Achilles tendinopathy, and we just ran him through a few eccentric isokinetic sets, and we're doing this at the end just to really work on that muscle endurance. It's a lot more fun than doing a simple calf raise. So again, these are really good for working on strength, endurance, neuromuscular control. So the last isotonic application is the one that I actually use the most, and it's for power training. So in it, I have it set for a certain amount of torque. I tell that patient I want you to do the concentric as hard and as fast as you can, and then just control it slowly coming down in the eccentric. So it's really good for working that concentric rate of force production. So it's going to help improve the person's power and really help them to get back to those sport-specific activities, loading the muscle with the high intensity, loading the joint with the high intensity.